right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning from Washington, D.C., and good afternoon to those in Europe and points beyond. I am Scott Cullinane. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S.-Europe Alliance, and we are a bipartisan initiative dedicated to mobilizing Americans to advocate for the enduring transatlantic partnership. Today, we have a truly all-star lineup to explore the topic of local media, why it matters, and the shared transatlantic struggle to see it continue. Let me recognize and thank our partners in hosting today's event. Radio Free Europe, first and foremost, especially the Washington, D.C. office. The Atlanta Press Club, one of the largest journalism associations in the U.S., and PEN America, America's premier organization defending freedom of expression. They all deserve credit, and I thank them all for their participation in today's event. Before I go any further, I'm so happy to say we have a number of first-time audience members. If you haven't already done so, let me encourage you to stay connected with USEA by following us on Twitter at USE Alliance and by signing up for our email list at useurope.org. Now, news and information is the window through which we see our broader reality. It is how we understand the actions of elected officials, and it enables how we as citizens participate in democracy. Over the past 5 or 6 years, I think it would be fair to say the public has become more aware of disinformation, conspiracy theories, fake news, and the blurring of fringe and mainstream media. And this is a problem in both the US and in Europe. As local media, that part of the news that is nearest to the consumer is subverted, constrained, or simply goes out of business. It is bad for our countries. It weakens the Transatlantic Alliance, which is built on the foundation of our successful democracies, our shared values and common interests, and it diminishes our soft power to be an example to other societies. And for those reasons, I think it is a critical transatlantic topic, and I'm so eager to hear from our speakers this morning. Joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, we have Ricky Bevington, who is a senior anchor and correspondent for Georgia Public Broadcasting. She's a host for NPR's All Things Considered, and she has earned more awards and accolades than I can possibly list here. From Prague, we have Arbana Vichichi, who is RFE's Balkan Service Director. Has been with RFE for over 20 years, 22 years in fact, and spent many of those years doing some really good reporting on the ground in Kosovo. And to moderate, we have Mr. Tom Melia, a former senior USAID official and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He currently works as the Washington Director for PEN America. Finally, I'll remind everyone that we are on the record and recording this event. We welcome audience questions. As questions occur to you, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll be collecting those. And with that, thank you, everyone. And Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to the U.S.-Europe Alliance for pulling us all together this afternoon. Our democracies are confronting multiple crises these days. And one of the central ones is the lack of confidence and trust in our public institutions. And one of the weaknesses that we are confronting in the United States and across many countries in Europe is the decimation of local journalism, which hitherto has been a vital building block of democracy. We at PEN America published a report just about a year ago called Losing the News, the Decimation of Local Journalism, in which we postulated that local news is a building block of democracy. It is a public good. It needs to be appreciated for the vital role it plays in strengthening our civic culture, making government institutions and large corporations transparent and accountable to the citizenry. And at this critical time, more than a quarter of all local newspapers have closed across the United States in the last 15 years. What that means is that there's less accountability journalism, there's less community spirit. People don't know their neighbors or their local officials as well anymore because they don't have an opportunity to read about them or hear from them. And studies have shown that the disappearance of local news from various communities means that citizens are less likely to vote, they're less politically informed, less likely to run for office. Studies also show that there's been a decline in the number of freedom of information requests across the United States as fewer and fewer journalists are there to file for government documents to do their investigations into government corruption or malfeasance. And so we're going to hear today from a distinguished American journalist, Ricky Bevington, about how this looks in her communities in the state of Georgia. We're going to explore some of the reasons for the disappearance of local journalism in the United States. And then we're going to also explore the reasons for the demise of independent local journalism in key parts of Europe, especially in the democratizing or the former communist countries that had been democratizing. Some of them have gotten off the rails, in part due to the takeover of many local news outlets by oligarchs and government allies that are eliminating that kind of investigative accountability journalism in countries like from Hungary and Poland and down into the Balkans. Let me mention that there's been, in the United States, there was in September, Senator Brian Schatz, along with Amy Klobuchar and Michael Bennet, introduced legislation that would create a federal advisory commission on the problem of local news and try to build a bipartisan consensus on possible solutions to reinvigorate local news in the United States. That will be reintroduced next month when the 117th Congress convenes, and we hope that there will be hearings in the Senate and additionally in the House to examine this issue. There's also a number of other pieces of legislation that have been introduced in the US Congress that would invigorate local journalism by creating tax credits for subscribers to purchase more subscriptions to newspapers, and also for local news outlets to hire journalists. So the reasons for the demise of local journalism in Europe are probably more political, whereas in the United States, there seem to be more economic. So we're going to explore both of those kind of stories and narratives and see what can be done to restore functioning independent local news outlets in both sides of the Atlantic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Arbana Bidishiki and ask her to tell us what she has seen across the former communist region that she and her bureau and her colleagues cover, and see what's happened there. So we'll start with the European version of the story. Arbana?
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, and hello, everyone. First off, let me just tell you what the Balkan service of Radio Free Europe covers. That's the Western Balkan countries like Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. You know, when the COVID pandemic has provided a fertile ground for these for authoritarian governments, wherever they are, not just in the Western Balkans, but an opportunity to take advantage of the fact that politics are on hold, the public is stunned, protests of some kind or any kind are out of the question, at least at the beginning. In order to impose these measures that would be, you know, many consider impossible in normal times. In many of these countries, state of emergency served to suffocate media freedom. And in this regard, the biggest victims were local media. From Russia to Belarus, the Western Balkans to Central Asia, governments attempted to criminalize free speech, criminalize journalism about the pandemic through emergency legislation and through ad hoc measures. Let's take Serbia's case, for example. On March 28th, just a couple of weeks after the first cases were registered there and the pandemic hit, the government approved a decree which allowed information related to the coronavirus outbreak to be published only if it comes from the National Crisis Management Task Force. Just a few days later, 2 days later, Serbian police detained a journalist in Novi Sad who wrote an article about a very prestigious website in Novi Sad, stating that medical staff at a hospital in northern city of Novi Sad lacked adequate protective gear. They interrogated the journalist overnight, confiscated her laptop and all her equipment, But then they released her on April the 2nd, just as the infamous decree was revoked, but only after an international outcry. There's another similar case. In April, an opposition activist in Montenegro, and Montenegro is a NATO member country, was arrested for allegedly posting fake news that Montenegrin President Milo Đukanović at the time, Milo Đukanović is no longer the president of Montenegro, he lost elections in August, that he was infected with COVID-19. These two examples are different in substance, but in both cases, government used the tools that we, the media, use for so long, debunking fake news. So with these actions, they were saying, actually, we're debunking fake news. This is not true. In the first case, in the journalist Lalic in Serbia, the days that followed proved the Serbian journalist right. The Novi Sad hospital was really overwhelmed. And the second case, the Montenegrin president was never reported to have been infected with coronavirus, but nevertheless, it was one Facebook post made for this opposition activist to be detained. Now, whenever whenever the public crisis hits, it's only normal that people go to local media, to domestic media, to get the information that they need. And if that media suffocates, then there's only one thing that flourishes, and that's disinformation. But to take advantage of the situation through ad hoc emergency measures, the suffocation of media was only to the benefit of this government who wanted, to grasp the power, don't let go. And they saw the only reasoning the biggest benefit they saw in that is suffocating those local media. And let's not forget, we're talking about a region here which has long had a very politicized, on ethnic basis, on political basis, extremely affiliated media landscape. This whole region is partly free on Freedom House Media and Freedom Index. It's only also partially free on annual reports of Reporters Without Borders. So we are dealing with countries that are strongly affiliated either with political parties or ethnic, playing on the ethnic card, religious, geographical. On the other hand, you also have a phenomenon which is going not only in the Western Balkans, but let's take Hungary, for example. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty opened the broadcast in Hungary just a year ago, and they have this amazing investigations that they've done, how editors manipulate news coverage at Hungary state broadcaster. It's still a phenomena. So this is a really, the pandemic just offered additional tools to those governments, wherever they are, be it in Western Balkans, within European Union, or the United States for that matter, to use them to suffocate media freedom. And then we have a direct consequence of it, which is disinformation.
Okay, we'll come back to disinformation shortly. Let's hear initially from Ricky Bevington from Atlanta, Georgia.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for that opening comments, Arbana. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the US-Europe Alliance, to the Atlanta Press Club, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, PEN America. It's a real pleasure to be in company with people who, frankly, everybody who's with us today has a lot of information and insight to offer. So I hope that people participate in the Q&A section and ask questions or make comments, because there's a lot of expertise on this webinar right now. I enjoyed how you distinguished, Tom, between the threats to local media being largely political in Europe, and these are broad generalizations, and in the US economic. It's a really helpful way to start thinking about it. Obviously, it's not that black and white, but when I think about what is local media in the United States, it's different from the US, from Europe, for example. Local media in America can serve one little town. I grew up in a town of about 35,000 people, and we had the Winchester Star, and every Thursday we got a print edition, and it was local high school sports stores and features about the ice cream parlor and a little bit of crime. Today it can serve a couple of counties, but largely local media in Georgia, for example, is either a major television network or it's a newspaper. And these organizations still exist on paper. However, their staffs have been so gutted that they are shadows of their former selves. So just because local media is surviving in name, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has the staff or money to do the service that it really needs to be doing. Certainly for a state like Georgia, which is the largest state east of the Mississippi River. It's a population 10 million people. And it's a very diverse state. We've got urban Atlanta, we have very rural farm country, a pecan country in South Georgia, big agriculture industry. So the more media, the merrier for as far as I'm concerned. In terms of the business models, the threats to the business models, obviously we all know that since the dawn of the internet, the traditional business model of advertisement funded media has been collapsing rapidly. And in that space, there's been a lot of experimentation. There's been a lot of failures. A lot of small papers have closed or been consolidated. They've been bought by hedge funds and rated for profits by hedge funds. They've been bought by, they've turned from for-profit newspapers to nonprofit newspapers. Some have just simply turned to philanthropic support. So I guess what I would say is that while there are incredible challenges to the business model of local media in the United States, and then if you just look at the raw numbers that Tom talked about, the closures of small town papers, the closures of media companies, television stations, radio stations, you can feel really disheartened. But then we look at particularly the innovations in philanthropy. Philanthropists, at least in the US, are realizing we need to step up. Not everybody is doing this, and there are examples of philanthropists who've closed outlets that they have bought. But we're seeing, for example, in the Southeast, ProPublica has committed to a serious investment, hiring new reporters to cover all of the Southeast. You know, a state like South Carolina, which is next to Atlanta, has one newspaper that's based out of Charleston. It's behind a paywall, you know, and I spend a lot of time in South Carolina, and I think there's a lot of work that could be done with a couple of a Freedom of Information Act requests in South Carolina. A lot of information could come to light in a state, and it is amazing what a couple of FOIAs can do for a community, for people to really know what's happening. So I also just want to talk about the role of media in the American democracy. You know, the US, we benefit from more than 2 centuries of a real cultural literacy about independent media and the free press. It is ingrained in our First Amendment, which includes the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, and the freedom to petition. And Americans know this, whether they can articulate it or not, that this is fundamental to our democracy. I was debating with a Serbian friend who's here in Atlanta about what is democracy. And he said, well, it's just voting. That's all democracy is. It's your right to go and vote. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting, because I think Americans would have a much broader, and others in Europe would have a much broader definition of what makes a democracy. No, there's democracy, and then there's healthy democracy. So, so I pushed back and I said, you know, if you couldn't read the paper, listen to me on the radio every day, you know, is that democracy really worth living in? And is it really functioning long-term? And is it sustainable? So I just, in terms of laying out a little bit more detail about kind of the situation in Georgia, just this past year, I think people have really realized that when a pandemic strikes, you know, CNN can't help you. CNN cannot tell you what the local restrictions are about where you can and can't go during a pandemic. They can't tell you what the mayor is saying today, what city council is doing, what the police are doing. And so people are turning to local sources in a way this year, and this is happening globally, that they never have before. And then with the George Floyd prompted protests nationwide and worldwide, again, we saw local media really stepping in. I was on the front lines covering protests and violence and communicating with police officers about where I could and couldn't stand and when they were going to be tear gassing so I could get out of the way, really working with local authorities. We did, of course, have some examples of media being arrested. Those were few and far between. I know we can look to bigger examples. Some of it was just misunderstanding by police officers who hadn't been trained on what media can do during a protest, or even journalists who were unseasoned and weren't quite sure that you shouldn't stand right in the middle of things when you're covering, you have a right to cover a protest, for example. And that's where an organization like the Atlanta Press Club can step in and help with educational programs for particularly young journalists who may need a little bit more guidance on how to cover a violent event, like a very chaotic event. So with that, I will say that I will explain, if it helps to anybody, for anybody to ask me a question. I work for a public-private partnership effectively. So in the US, we have purely commercial media enterprises that are just, they're public companies, they serve shareholders primarily. We have a hybrid, which would be kind of half and half. We have PBS and NPR, which are funded a little bit by the federal government, but by and large, they really fund their programming through private philanthropy and private donations. My organization does it on a state level. All of our programming is paid for with private dollars. Corporations, philanthropy, private citizens who want to give us money so that we can do what we do. We have, I wouldn't say that we have purely government funded media in the US. And then of course we have purely philanthropic media, which is, you have your Texas Tribunes, your ProPublica's, the 19th is a new publication centered on women in politics. This is where we're seeing the most growth in terms of the business model domestically for really successful and really meaningful media and journalism. And it's very, I see a lot of hope in that. So that's sort of the broad picture of the business model of media in the US. And, you know, none of them are perfect. And I personally believe we need the entire spectrum, so that we can, you know, where one fails, one steps in. We need all hands on deck. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ricky. Arbana mentioned how some governments have been exploiting the pandemic to shut down critical voices in journalism that would otherwise be pointing out the shortcomings by authorities in addressing the public health concerns, or covering up cases of public officials having the COVID virus themselves. We've had efforts in this country as well by the highest office in the land to try to control the narrative about what was happening with the public health crisis since it first emerged in the world at the end of January. But they mostly have not been successful. They've not been successful in controlling the narrative entirely, although there are a lot of people in the United States who believe the false narratives that have been promoted about the nature of the health crisis, the efficacy of things like wearing masks and closing businesses and schools. So we're living in a time when in the United States, we can't agree on what the facts are about the public health realities that surround us in this critical moment. In my youth, I worked for a prominent American senator named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and he coined the phrase in terms of public debate, saying that you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. We have to agree on what the facts are about anything before we can have an argument or a debate or a resolution of a policy making process. And the value of facts as the basis for public policy discussion is now a contested thing in the United States and certainly in parts of Europe as well. So I want to touch a little bit on how the pandemic has accelerated the demise of local news in the United States for a moment. The trends that Ricky and I have talked about, the economic forces that have driven a lot of local newspapers out of business. It's the social media platforms who have essentially taken their content and they've monetized it for their own purposes without sharing revenue with the newspapers they use for clickbait. And then there are also, as you mentioned, hedge funds gobbling up a lot of small newspapers and then essentially turning them into what we call ghost papers, where they look like they're a local newspaper, but in fact, they don't actually have any real journalism. They run wire service stories or other things, but they really don't have any local accountability journalism contained in them. During the pandemic, the remaining local advertisers that kept a lot of papers open, local theaters and restaurants and stores and arts festivals, all closed down their activities for many months. And so they had no reason to advertise. They had no money to advertise. And so that accelerated the pressure on newspapers across the United States. And we've seen an acceleration of furloughs of journalists. Some papers that were 7 days a week are now 3 days a week. Some only publish on weekend. Some only publish on weekdays. At the same time, many levels of government have designated local news outlets as essential services because of the information dissemination function that they're providing about closures and openings and rules on masks and other things. And a lot of the local newspapers have taken down paywalls so that people can access this kind of information, which has further accelerated the economic crisis. What local journalism will look like on the other side of this pandemic is, of course, a matter of speculation, but it looks like there will be many fewer journalists employed in the United States and many fewer outlets providing that kind of local coverage. I want to ask Ricky to pick up on what you've seen in Atlanta and in Georgia as a state. Have you seen these pressures accelerate during the pandemic? Have more and more outlets in your area closed down in these last 9 months? And
Absolutely.
will they revive on the other side of the pandemic, do you think?
You know, at the very beginning of the pandemic, I feel like maybe there was a 3-week period, and if there's any Atlantans on, throw it in the chat, where Atlanta Magazine was cutting its top leadership. Some of the local papers, Marietta Daily Journal, maybe a patch here or two, were just, I think there was so much uncertainty and so much fear at the very beginning that there was a lot of activity of journalists suddenly announcing, I'm looking for work. Just this past couple of weeks, we've seen several longtime journalists at our Cox is a privately owned, they own the newspaper, radio station, and television station.
Hey man, what you guys up to today?
Not much.
Folks have announced their retirement.
A dead tree that's supposed to be cut.
Kelly, can I ask? Okay, I think he's on mute now. So yes, we've seen cuts, absolutely, if that's your question. But again, we then get this announcement, Tom, that ProPublica is rapidly expanding throughout the Southeast. And again, I think this goes back to the point about quality over quantity, right? So we again, all media is important. It all serves, and as you said in your opening remarks, Tom, about community spirit, that newspapers that talk about the local ice cream shop opening or the high school sports stores, those are very, very important to us. But when a ProPublica comes in to fill the gap that only does investigative, hard-hitting, deep diving, the community gains as well. So we're seeing some losses and some wins.
Urbana, would you say that the pressures on local news or the takeovers of local news outlets in countries across the region have been accelerated during the pandemic? It was a couple years ago now, for instance, that friends of Prime Minister Orban in Hungary purchased hundreds of local outlets across Hungary, which is not a big country, but still had many, many local newspapers. And a lot of them have been gobbled up so that they print what the government wants them to print, more or less, nowadays, rather than trying to expose corruption or problems in local administration or national administration. And you mentioned some of the efforts by Serbian and Montenegrin authorities to punish journalists or control newspapers. Are there more political pressures on journalists, or are they more economic in terms of business people buying them up and then controlling what they present?
This region is more political, I have to say, and you were right to pinpoint on the Hungarian case here. RFERL is one of the reasons, is the reason why we are there is because of the situation with Hungary. Hungary is a EU member country, and one would ask, what is RFERL doing there? Our mission is we provide news that are otherwise unavailable to the local audience. That's our mission. we're present in 23 countries and 27 languages. So if you look at our mission and look at the Hungary, it's an EU country. So how come you're providing news that they're local news, news which you can't find in local media outlet? In this region, it's more political. It's if we take Serbia for example, I can actually in my hand, I can number how much media are truly independent. There's no financial sustainability across the region to the media, so they're either affiliated with a certain political group or, as I said earlier, ethnic, religious. Then we have a lot of media who have been connected with Kremlin in Russia, China, the Gulf, Turkey, or Qatar. So it's a really colorful, if I can call it that, media landscape in terms of affiliation. And this is where, this is the reason why not just RFERL, but we're trying to work, we're a platform for those local media, even for local journalists who want, we rely on those local reporting. Take the service that, the Balkan service, 5 bureaus, that's very complex service in different languages, different ethnicities, religions. So we're and thriving for that information. But politics has had a hard hand, a hard fist on local media, and by approving different laws, different decrees, and then pandemic hits, which is a paradise for them to suffocate all that, all those very, as Ricky pointed out, you can't rely on big TV stations like CNN or BBC World, and I'm the equivalent of them in our region. It's those local media that count, that will tell you, where do you get the vaccine? Where do you get the mask? Which pharmacy has the disinfectant? And I'm talking now about at the time when the pandemic hit at the beginning.
One of the questions that we're debating in Washington is the question of whether the government should subsidize local news. And it's very controversial, and journalists like Ricky in this country are on both sides of this question. They're very suspicious of government funding of journalism, for fear that it will inevitably lead to the government trying to control what the news coverage or editorial opinion is. And yet others see it as the only potential lifeline to keep some important outlets alive. One of the things that gets lost in this is the long history of public subsidies for journalism. For many decades, the Postal Service essentially delivered newspapers and magazines for free to their subscribers, and that constituted a significant subsidy for news organizations going back to the time of Benjamin Franklin and the founding of the Republic. And in recent years, as she mentioned, she works for the NPR affiliate in Atlanta, which is partially funded by government money, and does not seem to expose the local affiliates to pressure from Washington on what to cover or what not to cover. I was in a conversation earlier this week with Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who wants to propose the creation of something like a national endowment for journalism, which would provide direct subsidies to newsrooms to keep journalists on the job. That's very controversial. It may not get very far in our legislative process, but it represents an effort to underscore the importance of local journalism and to say the federal government should be subsidizing it. I want to ask Ricky where you come down on this question.
Great question, Tom. In fact, I just posted on my LinkedIn. I'll put it in the chat if I can find it. The Atlantic published an opinion piece in the last couple of days about this, very arguing for more public subsidies of media. I think the author was Rachel Cohen. If I can find it, I'll put it in the chat for everyone. Again, I will go back to my stance that no one system is perfect, and the more media plurality we have, the better. Even the conspiracy theorists have a place in our dialogue. I mean, I'm sort of firmly with Thomas Jefferson that it's all or nothing. It really is all or nothing. The government simply cannot get involved in this. They cannot be a mediator. Obviously, our courts do, to a point, get involved with free speech, particularly, or free press, if immediate danger to life or limb were at stake, but by and large, that's not the case. With government subsidized media, you will never be free of political suspicion by the opposition, so to speak. You can never be free of that. And at the same time, you also have an accountability and a transparency that comes with having tax dollars in your budget sheet. So that can be a good thing. There's real trade-offs. I have, because I work for a state authority that is a public-private partnership, I see both sides of it. I see how challenging it is to do the fundraising that we have to do. But I also see that we're not, when you have public subsidies, it's still there. We can't ignore that isn't part of our funding model. A lot of the best work comes, as Arbana can say, when everybody is on the same page and everybody just agrees to behave, so to speak, and agrees to not interfere with the newsroom. At the end of the day, regardless of what the business model is of the news organization, as long as there is a dedicated editorial firewall between the money and the reporters, it can work. But everybody has to agree to the firewall.
Well, we're certainly having a debate about that firewall in Washington around the public international broadcasting, as the U.S. Agency for Global Media's new CEO seems to be trying to tear down a traditional firewall between the political appointees and the government and the journalists who work for Voice of America and other international outlets, including Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I want to ask Arbana then, how does this appear to you far from Washington? We're working for a U.S. government financed media outlet there. Have you seen any pressure from Washington to skew the coverage in one way or another, or to take a particular editorial or reporting line?
No, I honestly haven't. And I am, Scott said at the beginning, I've been with this company for 22 years. I've been in Kosovo, covered the war there since 1999. One of the greatest joy that this huge company gives me is that it really recognizes the I don't want to call it pure, but truly professional journalism, and we do some remarkable work in terms of adhering to the standards and ethics. So, and no, I have not, as the Balkan Service Director, I have not experienced any pressure from Washington in this regard. And I don't think anybody in this company has, to be honest. This is a very complex company with a very noble mission. And we do, as I said earlier, our mission is to provide news to local media that are otherwise unavailable. And this is where we thrive, where we open the platform and the doors for those colleagues in our countries, which for some reason or the other don't have the opportunity to exercise their profession as journalists.
Right. Among the casualties, as local outlets have disappeared across the United States, have been ethnic and minority community oriented outlets, whether in print or online. And so there's a homogenization of news coverage that is happening in the United States, where these different languages, different affinity groups, different ethnic groups are losing the platform that they have had for many decades. And I'm just wondering whether, Ricky, you see that also in Georgia. Are there certain communities that are just no longer served, communities geographically or communities in terms of language groups or other local papers?
That's a great question. And I don't feel that I'm qualified to answer because, Georgia's so big and I don't have a list of media organizations that, have closed or opened in the last couple of years. I will say that Atlanta has a very rich history of African-American journalism. The Daily World, excuse me, the Atlanta World was started by the Scott family. And, you know, obviously that's our city's history. I will say that there was a grants recently announced, and I can't remember the organization. This goes back to sort of the role of philanthropic media in Georgia specifically right now, partnering up. Basically, I think it was Report for America placing journalists in newsrooms. So I think 2 were going to the Athens Banner Herald. One of them was a photojournalist to cover communities of color around Athens, which is a university town about an hour outside of Atlanta. I think there were 2 reporters at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, our main paper, again, to cover historically undercovered communities, typically of color, LGBTQ in Metro Atlanta. And then a 3rd recipient of this grant and sort of these reporters' place was an organization called The Plug, which is an African-American entrepreneurial, they cover Black entrepreneurs on Black college campuses. So very, very, very specific group, HBCUs, there's a lot in Atlanta and Georgia. So those would be examples, I think, of where there is a recognition that there are a lot more people that need to be covered and served, both covered and served as audience members of media in Georgia, locally.
Okay. And Arbana, are there unserved communities in your region, even just in the Balkan, where people cannot hear the news, whether on radio or television, in their own language? Or do you
absolutely.
feel have enough services that you've covered all the language groups?
No, there's the Western Balkans specifically is a country, you know, Yugoslavia dissolved, and then you had all these countries which had different ethnic minority groups within. Each of these countries strives to open via public broadcasters, like a program for minorities, but that's really very limited. Some have progressed, the others not as much, but you have like, I don't know, a couple of hours a day of news in Albanian, in Serbia, or in Montenegro. There's like that. Now the system of the cable system has enabled them to consume the news from, you know, neighboring Albania or neighboring Bosnia. But the thing is, the journalists from those communities that come out, like let's say from the Serbian community in Kosovo, which is a minority, not that for that specific journalist, which comes from a minority group, it's very, very difficult to find a job and to sustain the job financially. So there's literally one way for that person to get work, and that's to enter the public broadcasting, which in each of these cases in Western Balkans is always tightly connected with the government or whichever political party is in power. And that's really very, very, very hard for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Scott, I want to go back to US-Europe Alliance and see if there's any questions coming in. I don't think I've seen any questions in the chat. But I want to invite people around this virtual roundtable to jump in if people have comments or questions they want to pose to any of our journalists here today. Don't be shy.
Yes, and actually on that note, I do have a question here. And obviously we discussed the difference in the challenges to local media in the US being more economic and Europe broadly being more political. And one question was, in Europe, if there was reversal of some of these political challenges to media and local media, would there be the same underlying economic difficulties in both continents? You know, if we peeled off the political challenges, is there still the same underlying economic difficulties in both cases?
Do you want me to take this
question?
Yeah. Okay. When I said previously broadly political, well, you don't get to politics without money. So there's an economy there too. So, and I think the hardship would be, again, probably the same, at least in Europe's case, because it's very interconnected, and the affiliation interests are, it always comes to economy, money, power equals politics.
Scott, can you say the question again? I was sending the article to the group in the chat, so I think I missed the beginning. If you could just repeat it and I'll answer.
Sure. Yes. The question was on this contrast between the economic challenges in the U.S. and the maybe more political in Europe. And the question was, in the European context, if you had a reversal of those political restrictions or reversal of those political challenges, would there be the same underlying economic difficulties? Is the economic model challenged in the same way in both contexts?
That's a great question. The only way I know how to answer that is that powerful people will always want to squelch independent voices, no matter what the political system is, no matter what the economic system is. It goes back to the saying, the pen is mightier than the sword. It's no wonder that every strong man, whatever word you want to use, the first sort of the playbook is to immediately attack the media. We see this in Hungary. The population of Hungary is smaller, a little bit smaller than the population of my home state of Georgia. So for me to imagine, a governor being elected and immediately buying up every media, having his wealthy friends buy up every media organization in the state, and then take over the public broadcaster. And he did this all legally, Orban and Fidesz, they had a supermajority in parliament, so it was all above board. It's extraordinary what has happened in Hungary, all through a democratic process. So I would say that the politics can change, the character personalities can change, the money can change, but media will always be under attack, because media will always be speaking truth to power. And it's what we do. It's what half the people on this Zoom do for a living. And it's what human beings do. Because whether or not I think people can articulate why they believe in freedom of press or freedom of speech, it's because nobody wants to be lied to. That's a very, very fundamental sort of part of human nature. And I hope that we as professionals can continue to support that. That may not have answered your question, Scott, but those are my thoughts.
No, it's wonderful, and sorry to steal the microphone, Tom, but I'll just take a moment because I mentioned on Orban and Hungary several times, and I'm so happy you brought it up in your last remarks. And I know not most people on this Zoom right now probably aren't foreign policy nerds in the way I pride myself in being, but this is so dangerous for the Transatlantic Alliance, and Hungary is a member of NATO. We are in a treaty alliance with Hungary, and NATO is a consensus-based organization, and any one member of NATO can block action. And this is, a pillar, a foundation of our national security, has been for decades, and hopefully will be for decades. And when we see this sort of backsliding, this sort of reversal, to me, this sets off alarm bells. And I'm so happy you were able to put it into the context of Georgia, because so often, here in DC, we talk about these things in such, foreign policy terms. It's hard to sometimes put them in context. So I thought you did that very well. Thank you for saying that.
I want to ask, we're getting close to the end of our hour, and I want to pursue a couple of other topics here. One is what happens to the space that is emptied when local news outlets go out of business? Nature abhors a vacuum. And what we've seen in some places is that gap gets filled by either commercial entities that pretend to be newspapers in order to attract subscribers or audience, but they're not really providing news, they're providing a political line. And that's been proliferating in parts of the United States in the last couple of years from both right-wing and left-wing perspectives, although I think it's more common, more visible, at least among people with a very hard right perspective, setting up these kind of artificial newspaper shells online mainly in order to push a particular political narrative. And I'm going to come back to Ricky in a minute, but I want to put it to Arbana. Are there information deserts that get filled in Eastern Europe by politically directed propaganda or pushing, disinformation to various communities? And how do you at RFE respond to that?
Oh, there's a whole world of them in the Western Balkans, and EU is not immune either. I mentioned earlier about whenever you suffocate free media and freedom of speech, and those brave local journalists are faced with different hardships, that's where disinformation flourishes. And I'm not talking about the cliche fake news. I'm talking about targeted disinformation. And Western Balkans is literally the nest of it either from Russia, China, Turkey, Qatar. These are four main foreign external factors that have entered the information landscape in this region. Russia goes more on political impact by financing different local media. And just this approach actually demonstrates the power the local media had. When we talk about Russian disinformation, everybody looks at Sputnik or Russia Today. That's actually a decor, because the real disinformation tools are within those local media. So what we did as RFERL after we saw that you can do debunking as much as you like, but it's very difficult to say to somebody, look, you're stupid because you're believing that. You have to listen to reasoning. Why are they prone to believe that theory and not this one, or that argument or not this one? What we saw is that the money was going to local media because they didn't have enough staff to fill the newspapers or radio program or TV program. So we came up with the idea that we're going to offer them our content free of charge. We're going to offer them via newsletters, via RSS feed, whatever they want, video production, because we're called Radio Free Europe, but we're much more than that. And this is where we were literally in the race with them, specifically in Serbia, Montenegro, and part of Bosnia, which is inhabited by Serb population, and it's called Republika Srpska. This was our mission, and we have attracted a big number of media subscriptions to our content, which is one of the greatest success. China goes more on infrastructure, and it is very unfortunate that actually EU has even warned Montenegro, which again is a NATO member country, because Montenegro now, Montenegro's debt, GDP debt, is so high to China, and it tackles most infrastructure. And then there's Bosnia, which is divided between Turkey and Russia. So on one hand, you have Russia in Republika Srpska, which is inhabited by a majority of Serbians, and then you have Turkey in the Federation of Bosnia, which is a majority of Muslim. So it's really Balkans is like a playground for either Kremlin or any of these centers that I mentioned before. The testing of boundaries, and the media offers, local media specifically, offer a perfect tool for it.
Ricky, what do you see in the Atlanta area in terms of?
Well, I can tell you that many on this webinar will know that Georgia has 2 US Senate runoffs right now that will determine control of the United States Senate. 2 Republican incumbents with very strong challenges from Democratic challengers. And we're seeing this play out in real time in Georgia after the November 3rd general election. And there was a kind of a critical mass of conspiracy theories on social media that the election was rigged. I mean, and we saw national press conferences from people saying that the Venezuelans had bribed our governor to rig the election, and China was somehow involved, and Hugo Chavez somehow from the dead has been meddling in Georgia elections. But I will echo what Arbana said. We journalists can't say to people, you're crazy, you're believing lies and conspiracy theories, because for whatever reason they believe that. So our job as local journalists is to keep doing what we have always done, but maybe do it a little bit better, maybe do it a little bit louder, but which is to tell the truth. So Tom, your question was when news deserts are created, what fills the void, right? You know, there's no lack of information in Georgia about the truth. Let's just use the election, okay? Every major journalist organization in the country really is zeroed in on Georgia. There's no lack of information for how this election took place, the technology, the laws. I mean, it's exhaustive. If people choose not to avail themselves of the truth, no number of added newspapers or television stations or radio stations or websites will counter that. But finally, to your final question, Tom, yes, since the general election, we have seen news organizations pop up in Georgia alleging to be news, but are simply propaganda machines. They call themselves a newspaper, an online newspaper, but they're just political propaganda. And then finally, this simply goes to media literacy, is how can we help people understand the difference between what looks like a news website and what is a news website. And that's a problem that, and these are all problems that many, many good people around the world are working to solve.
Yep. No, and we at PEN America have been engaged in some of that problem solving by organizing training sessions for various communities on media literacy, often working in partnership with libraries and other educational institutions across the country, and also trying to expose and clarify what is disinformation versus fact-based journalism. If you go to our website at pen.org, you'll see a range of program activities in this area that might be of interest to people on this call. Well, we've gone over an hour, we're just about at the hour, and I wanted to see if Arbana or Ricky wants to make a final statement before we draw to a close. Arbana?
Well, it's been a real pleasure to have talked with you all and listen to it's very interesting to listen to Ricky and to, you know, the completely different perspectives. There's only one thing I would like to say, and this is, you know, I've been in journalism for 22 years and, you know, covered wars and all the way until the pandemic. I just know that if something taught me while I was journalist all these years, is nobody should ever underestimate the power of information. I like to call it as the vaccine against the disinformation. So please support local journalism. Thank you.
Okay, the vaccine against disinformation. I like that.
Amen. And I will simply say that, at least in the United States, there are millions of Americans who recognize the problems that are happening in our media ecosystem. And particularly private philanthropy, and Arbana talked about how you're getting more memberships and subscriptions. I think that we're seeing that. So the old models of journalism, the business models of journalism are fading away, and new revenue sources are developing. And it's the people, it's our audience members, it's our neighbors, our families, and our fellow citizens who will help us solve this problem. It's not all for us to bear, this burden of the demise of independent media. It's really about us being emissaries and ambassadors in our communities to help really everybody understand its value. So thank you for the work that you do, Arbana and Tom and others on this call.
Well, I recall that my first paying job was delivering newspapers in various neighborhoods in Connecticut and then New York. Once upon a time, my mother would have to come out to the curb and tell me after school, because I would stop and read the newspapers instead of delivering them. And it's the beginning of my interest in world affairs. So newspapers can change a life. And I hope that we'll have hard copy newspapers with us for a long time. But even as we rely more and more each day, it seems, on digital platforms to get our news and to circulate information. And with that, I'm going to thank Ricky and Urbana for their contributions here and turn it back over to Scott to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much. We talked about lots of challenges and problems today, but hearing the conversation and knowing that we have people like Urbana, and Ricky doing the work of being journalists, gives me a lot of confidence in the future, both for our country and for Europe. So I'll close simply by thanking our audience members, thanking our speakers, and again, thanking Radio Free Europe, PEN America, and the Atlanta Press Club for agreeing to be part of this. I'm so grateful, and I will wish everyone a happy holiday season, and stay tuned for more interesting and unique events in the new year. So take care, everyone.
Okay.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays. Thank you.
Thanks,
Happy
Scott.
holidays. Thanks to everyone for participating.